In Chapter 16, Feyerabend argues that comparing scientific views with non-scientific views is not possible in a number of cases. He remarks that certain theories are understood and accepted well enough to have developed their own associated languages. This seems reasonable. Feyerabend discusses the view of Wolff, who asserts that language contains a view of the world that
influences thought, behavior, perception.
Feyerabend includes two diagrams which are examples of visual illusions. He argues on the basis of the effects elicited that we are able to change our perceptions at will, and that our mental sets are culture dependent. After choosing lines to focus on, our perceptual apparatus completes the remainder. Since we can choose the lines initially, we can also choose our corresponding perception. He also gives the example of after images and uses these examples to suggest that alternatives to science cannot be considered simultaneously, and that there must be a set shifting from one to the other, and the inference he makes is that these separate approaches shape our perceptions of the world. He goes on to examine different styles of art in history. He examines ancient styles of art including Egyptian and Greek art. He draws parallels between ancient Greek art and literature, and argues that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that ancient Greeks perceived the world differently to the way that his audience does. About Egyptian art in particular, he writes,
In the frontal art of the Egyptians, are explained by Louis, natural, physiological reasons are given for the archaic style and for its change.
However, from an online resource about Egyptian art, it is written that
Egyptian canonical art has a different function, which has nothing to do with representing reality.
instead, there is an underlying philosophy that constrains the Egyptian art, and thus it is not surprising that while the prevailing art fits with cultural norms, there are small variations where a more realistic individual style emerges. All of this challenges Feyerabend's inferred argument that ancient peoples had a different physiology which caused their art to differ. If we inferred a different physiology on the basis of artistic styles, then it could be argued that in the 20th century the human race experienced several dramatic changes in physiology which caused them to express the world differently in the forms of Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and pop art. However, this would be an erroneous conclusion. His argument is that we cannot understand the competing view unless we step into the world of the other civilization. Nevertheless, it can also be argued that if there is an alternative to science that offers us useful knowledge about the world, but without it being a science, then it should be possible to obtain measurable predictions from this approach. These can be tested against predictions by the relevant body of scientific knowledge. Thus it becomes possible to sample and test this alternative without needing to step entirely into the other world view. In this way, Feyerabend's assertion that
the kind of comparison that underlies most methodologies breaks down when we try to compare non-scientific views with science
can be challenged. Feyerabend takes us from the perceptual world of the ancient Greeks to the modern perceptual world, drawing a parallel with science, and taking the opportunity to note that there are several forms of logic, that logic does not unify all of the sciences, that it is not integral to the process of discovery, before identifying a need for anthropological studies. He discusses the benefits of anthropological fieldwork in science so as to better understand real-world science, and here I agree with him. He is also critical of epistemologists because
they never inquire, or even find it worth inquiring, whether the conditions are satisfied in this real world of ours.
However, it is with the results of such an analysis that Feyerabend's arguments would have been more robust. Indeed, I would have argued that without the results of such fieldwork, Feyerabend's suggestion of the irrelevance of logic in the scientific process is speculative, and therefore on the basis of his discussion alone, there would be equal weighting to both this hypothesis and the counter-hypothesis if it were judged on the basis of empirical evidence. Looking from a wider perspective, however, it is likely that in addition to logic, pattern recognition, serendipity, systematic trial and error, and expertise would all play a role in this process. Although I would disagree with the material he uses for his approach, I would agree that research is needed in this area. However, Feyerabend does not expand on the scope of such research, other than to say that it would be anthropological and to outline how the basics of this approach might work. It is clear that careful consideration would need to be given to which branches of science are to be studied. In this appendix, Feyerabend disagrees with Wolff on some points about his assertions about language. For instance, he remarks that animals do not have language, in the sense that Wolff means it, and yet their world is not shapeless. He also reiterates that theories in the way scientists use them are different from the transformed theories that have been clarified utilizing logic and other tools, and which is then studied by philosophers. In this chapter, Feyerabend argues that rationalism is a tradition. However, I would argue that if by rationalism he means the application of reasoning, then there is evidence that species such as chimpanzees, rooks and crows are capable of this. For instance, wild chimpanzees have been observed to use anvils with cleavers to break food down into smaller portions. A bonobo is observed using a rock to break down food, in a video linked to in the written article. A rook is seen to use two stones in sequence to release food from a test tube in a clip, again at a link in the written article. While it could be possibly argued that chimpanzees and bonobos are engaging in traditions handed down by other members of their group, it is more difficult to explain the rook's behaviour in this way. It seems highly unlikely that rooks would teach their young to transfer stones between test tubes of differing sizes in order to obtain food. It seems more likely that the rook is able to reason that certain actions will result in the release of food. It can be further concluded, if the above holds, that reasoning is a biological trait, and this would be consistent with adaptation to the environment in which various species utilize a knowledge of cause and effect to anticipate events in the environment and to exert control over the environment in order to meet the needs of underlying biological drives. It further follows that if reasoning is a biological trait, then the tradition of rationalism is simply the repeated use, refinement of, and shared development of an inherent trait. Furthermore, if rationalism is an inherent trait, then we would also expect to see it utilized in other traditions. Furthermore, it would not be unreasonable to speculate that the foundations of science lie in an inherent ability to identify and utilize causal sequences in the environment upon which layers of complexity have been added over time through the shared communication and development of this understanding in the scientific community by means of language. If this were the case, then it would help to explain the cultural association between science and logic, which Feyerabend has taken some effort to challenge. The suggestion in this discussion that there is an inherent biological trait underlying science is, however, speculation. Feyerabend considers the observers and participants in a tradition referring to the Hegelian dialectical framework that can be used by observers. He discusses participants and then looks at rationalism in more detail, suggesting that it arises in two main forms, naturalism and idealism. He is again dismissive of medicine in another offhand comment, and I found this particular comment unnecessary. Again, I would qualify this as an unhelpful prejudice and another example of pseudo-philosophy. Feyerabend goes on to discount idealism by asserting that the adherent soon realizes that expectations do not meet real-world results. However, such a statement in itself does not offer support for his assertion, and either supporting reasoning or evidence is needed to justify this. Feyerabend also asserts that the use of standards in both idealism and naturalism results in the